I vividly remember Jack Benny and Rochester coming into the rotunda of the depot, and always the performer, Jack Benny, would say a few jokes and Rochester would laugh. And
1942, in the month of June, where the governor had called our superintendent and told him that the reports were that there was a good chance we was going to get bombed that night.
When the war started, we had probably 3,500 people working for the railroad between Centralia and Everett.
All right. The last 3 weeks of the war, we were. They sent us on ahead of the German army, and we were up at northern Italy. The German army all behind us. It was quite an experience there to get out of that.
Pala was the little dog's name. He had gotten out of Franklin Roosevelt's private train and was running down the track and quickly followed by someone from the train. But the newspaper reporters never reported that.
During that period where they thought we was going to get bombed, they did issue gas masks.
When I came to work here in 1943, there were lines at the ticket window all the way out to Pacific Avenue with servicemen going home on furlough.
Somebody said last time they rode a train was during World War II, and they don't want to ride them again, but they had to pick up everything they had at that time just to have enough equipment to handle all of these people.
I worked as a steno-taking train messages.
That was the logical assumption. Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and the Northwest would be next.
We had to black out our stations, and of course we had to have some lights for our whoop stands because they couldn't pick up their orders. But we had covers so that they just shone directly out.
It was flooded with trains during the war.
And you'd see a whole group of maybe 25 recruits in their civilian clothes going down to get on a troop train.
In fact, one of the trainmen one day came running up the stairs and says, did you know that President Roosevelt is down on the platform there with his dog?
They had a blackout all over town, and the depot had skylights right at the very top of the rotunda ceiling was a glass skylight, and there were skylights each side of the rotunda, and they painted them black.
And I remember having to walk maybe 5 blocks in the dark to catch the bus to go to work at 5 a.m.
We had several presidents park at the depot there for a day or two.
Most of what I typed were the Russian Lend-Lease waybills because things came through Tacoma, went out on ships on the Lend-Lease program to Russia.
When we drove to work, we couldn't put our car lights on. We had to drive slow enough and keep your head out the window.
That's where I was working when I took my retirement in the summer of 1945, and we had our first son in September.
From the earliest days, watching Ann Southern in Private Secretary, I knew that's what I always wanted to be.
We used to go down to there on 15th Street to the yard and ride around on the engine with him once in a while his fireman was shoveling coal.
I was born in Montana, in a section house. My dad was a section foreman at the time.
When my father was working out in the line, I was 2-3 years old, and he'd go from station to station, and the train crews would get off the caboose or get off the engine and come into the station for their orders, and I was always running around the station, and they all called me Little Buddy.
My dad worked for the railroad, and he suggested that I get acquainted around with the duties of the crew callers.
So there I was, 14 years old, sophomore in Bellarmine High School, and I was suddenly the second trick crew caller for the Northern Pacific.
I worked 4 to midnight down here at the depot for the railroad, and then I'd go to school during the daytime. And he had a vacant position called a call boy or crew caller. Your duties there were to call up conductors and engineers and brakemen and firemen and tell them what time to report for duty, because on freight trains they didn't always go to work at the same time every day.
And then he didn't like to be away from home, so he was mainly on the switch engine here in Tacoma.
And my father lived till 102, so he had a good, healthy life. My mother was 93 when she passed away, so she had a good life too.
My dad influenced me greatly. He told me in high school, when I went to high school, you could take typing and shorthand. And he says, you take shorthand and you take typing. And I wouldn't have maybe even thought about it, but I took it and I was very good at it.
Yes, I grew up on a dairy farm.
My parents homesteaded in eastern Montana when I was a small youngster. Then we moved to Billings, where I got my education. I graduated from high school there in 1930 in the early part of the Great Depression. And there weren't very many opportunities for work in those days. I mean, times were real tough.
My parents had a 160-acre farm, which is quite small, although it wasn't at that time.
My great-grandfather came here in 1899 from North Dakota, and my grandfather came here in 1900.
The history of railroading goes way back in my family. My mother's father, my granddad, was a boilermaker for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
My whole family worked for the railroad in one way or another. My father worked at the roundhouse as a machinist and later as an engine inspector. My uncle, Matt Merkel, was a blacksmith foreman in the repair shops in South Tacoma. My father had worked there. My grandfather worked there.
My father worked for the Milwaukee Railroad, and his date went back to 1914.
So it was more or less expected that I should end up working for the railroad.
You know, he always knew he was going to have a paycheck. We had a real secure childhood.
And on weekends, I'd usually go up to see my father, and which would be maybe at Stampede or wherever he was working.
My father was laid off during the Depression, and the federal government passed a law that all railroad equipment had to be equipped with air brakes. They could no longer use hand brakes.
Her first job, and she's making just $10 less a payday than myself.
And all during the war, he was the night chief dispatcher at the Union Station in Tacoma.
She used to like to tell stories about the soldiers that would come in from Fort Lewis for tickets. And some of them would be from some of these really remote regions in the South. They had no idea what route they would have to take to get home. And she'd have to start shuffling through all the ticket catalogs there to figure out how to route these kids home. And in those days, they didn't use coupon tickets. They used these long streamers.
I was actually hired by my uncle.
And he worked as a crane operator for the section. And he worked on the work trains, and when they were always having slides along Point Defiance, I remember him every Christmas having to be working down there because they were always having slides.
Years ago, too, like the Northern Pacific was more like a family-run railroad. I mean, the fathers would have sons working, and you almost had to know someone to get a job with the railroad.
We were going to train to be school teachers. At that time, they paid about $45 a month, and we heard about the telegraphers on the railroad that were getting about $160 a month at that time.
I was, at one time, the first sergeant of the band in the Bellarmine Junior ROTC unit. And we wore the uniforms once a week, but not the complete uniform, just the trousers and shirt. So I had these big old first sergeant stripes on my sleeve, and one of my jobs was to run a train order after the last passenger train had left Tacoma over to the roundhouse so the switch crews would know that all the passenger trains had departed. So I go waltzing down onto the station platform, and here's a troop train filled with German POWs from the Africa Corps. And they took a look at me with all these stripes on my arms and my rather youthful face, and their eyes like bugging out of their heads, like, this is an Army sergeant that defeated us?
Started out as a telegraph operator, working a lot of the stations, McCarver Street, and then Nisqually and Ridgefield, and quite a number of the different towns along the coast here.
I had to break in for 6 months on my own time before I could get my first job, my first day's work. And then it was $5.67 a day. And that was a union job, 67.5 cents an hour.
After about 4 or 5 days, he asked me if I thought I could take the engine up and coal it and water it during the weekend if he left to see his girlfriend in Seattle. And I said, well, yeah, I think I can. So he left for the weekend, and I ran this engine around town. He had to cross a couple of streets and so forth, but I was careful when I did it, and everything worked out fine.
I started for the railroad at the head of the Bay Yards in Tacoma, Washington in September of 1946.
I remember the first thing they asked me to do was to go and find a seal for a flat car. Well, of course, that was the big joke for every new person that went to work, because of course a flat car doesn't have a seal. But I didn't know that, because I knew that trains went on a track, but that was about all I knew about trains.
After I worked as an operator for a couple of years, I was promoted to assistant chief not assistant chief dispatcher, but just train dispatcher, and worked in the office in the Union Station at Tacoma for, and actually I ended up working there for the rest of my life, my working life.
I started in 1941 as a telegraph operator, and my first job was 15th Street Tower. A fellow by the name of Hal Bradbury laid off one day so that I could get my seniority date.
You work as an extra dispatcher quite a bit, and then you go back to telegraph, and you're an extra dispatcher, and you go back to telegraph. And I worked at the relay office, a WR office they call it, in the depot down there.
One of the fellows that had a regular job got involved with a girl, and I don't know, they were planning to get married or something, I don't know, but apparently she was stepping out on him, and he got quite aggravated and upset, and he took a shot at her and then shot himself, which left a vacancy.
And he told me to learn every job down there, because that would ensure that I would always be working.
Past 4 o'clock, except for the important jobs, all the kind of, you might say, ancillary jobs around the place were run by a bunch of high school kids. I was going to high school, the third trick caller was going to high school. A lot of the girls that worked in the station lunch counter were high school girls. A couple of the night clerks, one of the baggage handlers. There were so many high school kids here because of the manpower shortage during World War II.
And we were known by the nickname of mud hops, because we worked out in the yard physically checking cars with forms, and some of these forms you had 5 carbons in them, so they were lots of fun when it was raining out there, and everybody tried to come up with some original idea to keep the form dry so they could write in the rain. And of course, to go through 4 carbons, you had to use about a number 4 pencil, which was like writing with a nail.
And of course, at that time, male stenos were quite active in the railroad industry. So I got sent down here at the railroad to apply for a job, and I went to work the day I came down.
Eventually, I was appointed chief dispatcher when A.W. Ackley retired, and was on that job for 22 years, and I might say enjoyed every minute of it. It was just a great job and great people to work with, and very interesting.
Mr. Ackley, we called him Ack. He was a good old soul, and he'd cover up for you.
Initial, like a gondola, it was a G, a covered hopper was a CH, a single door box car was a B, a double-door boxcar with an A, and I could go on and on.
Almost everybody had a father or brother or sister also working for the railroad.
Our son Don went to telegraph school that my husband got started at Clover Park Technical School.
Just to the office down there, everybody helped everybody. You didn't want anybody to get in trouble.
They said that they had a special place in hell for all CS clerks for the lying that they had to do.
And one time I had a conductor, I think it was, report for duty. And I had him report for the wrong day. So when it was time for that train to depart King Street, there was no conductor. So the superintendent at the King Street station had to act as conductor from Seattle to Tacoma. And of course that was embarrassing to me. And when I told the superintendent here that I had made that blunder, he just laughed and said, oh, it's about time that superintendent of the King Street station earned his pay.
Sometimes you had to do a little fudging, and so we did a terrific business for running cars in from South Tacoma and out to South Tacoma, because that was a different yard.
There was an unfortunate incident in front of the station here with one of our train dispatchers got hit by a streetcar.
My first shift was on May 30th, 1930 at 11 p.m., which was a holiday. I got time and a half for my first shift, $4.73.
They had a kind of a tough life. Things were slow during the time that they were working, and he was up in age by the time that he got to be chief dispatcher.
When the Depression really hit that part of the country, and the railroad laid off an awful big bunch of people. They laid off everybody possible. So I reverted to the extra list. I worked just a few days between then and the fall of 1933.
Well, I very rarely had a weekend off because I didn't have enough seniority to get a job with a weekend off.
Someone with more seniority took the job, and I was forced onto a messenger job.
I had a regular job. Then when the war was over, I got booted out of the dispatcher's office. I was 10 times out on the extra list.
So we learned the job as a general rule before we took it over. It isn't like in recent years when you go on a job and then they educate you as to what the job is.
There are lots of rules concerning the furnishing of equipment to the customers.
And that was the scariest time of my life when I first went in there to break in. You'd sit with a regular dispatcher, and he'd show you the ropes and how to do this and do that, and he'd let you sit down there.
I came right here to the Union Station and walked up to the counter where all these important people were sitting behind this counter. And I asked to talk to the chief clerk. And this gentleman comes up to me, and I said, I want to bid on this job. And he says, well, you don't even work for the railroad. And I says, no, I know that. Well, he gave me a test on the spot, and I did pretty good with my shorthand and my typing, apparently. And he hired me right then, and the next day he sent me to work in Everett.
One of the jobs involved picking up the mail from the baggage room, the company mail, and then distributing it to the offices around the depot. And in order to do that, we had to have a pass key. So the night station manager, a gentleman by the name of Howe, always had kind of a jaundiced eye on this high school kid running around the depot late at night, going in and out of all the offices.
You'd be on time because there's lots of people watching you. You walk into an office that had probably 6 people right in the office you're at. And it was, the majority of them were men, which makes a very nice work atmosphere.
During the war, too, we had to hire a lot of women as telegraph operators. And they're still good friends of mine yet.
The division offices here would send out instructions to their people out in the field by Morse message, and then also people out in the field would send in reports and telegrams to the headquarters.
So my first job was Third Trick Kelso, and I was down there all the summer of 1945.
And it seemed like the phones would go, but the Morse somehow or other was the last to go, and when your phone failed, you'd go to the Morse code.
Like the late 50s and 60s, where we started phasing out the telegraph and using more telephone, and that period eventually ended with no telegraph at all.
You would be subconsciously listening to the telegraph and carrying on a conversation with somebody else in there or on the phone, and as soon as something on the telegraph would mean something to you, or it would pick up your interest, you could immediately switch over and pick it up.
So she went enrolled in the Spokane Telegraph School, and then when she graduated, came to Tacoma.
You pick up a telephone and you hear the voice on the phone and you know who it is. With telegraph, it's the same way.
Do that telegraphing, it never leaves you. You could always, 20 years later, if you haven't even telegraphed, why, you hear this, somebody talking on the Morse, why, you can understand it.
He couldn't send a J. And every time that he would come to a J, there'd be a hesitance.
We could talk fast and say, how are you doing today, and what you have for breakfast, and so on like that. And it was just a nice way to communicate. And then you get down to business and send the messages.
Every little town at that time had its own railroad station, which was the railroad office for the town. It's all become centralized now.
I did start the telegraph school at Clover Park when we were awful hard up for telegraphers and couldn't get enough.
They get a stiff wrist where they start going. They couldn't stop going.
Well, there was even a station agent telegrapher out at the end of 6th Avenue.
Their sending was like music to you. We had others that you had to strain to copy. And the railroad wouldn't allow a typewritten order until about until about 1935, I guess.
When I first went to work, there were no hoop stands. You stood out next to the track and you raised this forked stick into the air, and the crew came along and jerked the string off of it that held their train orders. And the most fun place to do this was Nisqually. Nisqually was on the apex of a very long curve, and it was also fairly flat track, so when the trains would come down there, they would be going at a pretty good clip. And where you had to stand, you had the feeling the train was heading right for you. And about 20, 30 yards before it got to where you were standing, then it would go into the curve and heel over. But this made the cab heel away from you, so that you had to lean further into the train in order to get the hoop up.
Everything ran on train orders then. And all the trains, the lives of the crew, everything was in the hands of the train dispatcher and the operators.
So you waited until the train crossed into the plant, threw the lever back, and then ran down 2 flights of stairs carrying these 3 hoops and across 3 sets of tracks to run the hoops up to the train. Well, for a freight train, that was nothing because they travel fairly slow. But for a passenger train, they kind of come along rather quickly. So
when a train crew would come around the curve there and they'd see that yellow signal, they knew they had orders to pick up.
And my earliest experience at the Union Station was as a little girl coming down with my dad, who worked as a crane operator for the railroad. And he'd go downstairs to do his business, and my sister and my brother and myself would go all the way to the very top where they had a model train go completely around the dome. And we'd chase it around, and the porters would tell us to knock it off, and it wouldn't bother us a bit. We'd just chase that train all the way around.
But I used to take the boys down there, and most of the time to keep them occupied, there's lots of stationery and pens and pencils. And then when we got the CT machine, why, they'd sit there and I'd tell them what button to push. And
My father worked 50 years for the railroad. My grandfather worked 42 years. My great-grandfather worked 43 years. So, and then before that, I don't think there was such a thing.
Well, there were 4 or 5 of us auditors there, and we had big oak office desks and the old oak office chairs, swivel chairs.
Each dispatcher had a cubicle of his own. Most of the time there wasn't any door on it. And it had the soundproof, the stuff on the wall with the holes in it, you know.
Bridge, and it was hot and heavy for 1 hour. Everybody'd sit there and eat their lunch and play bridge.
With it. And every once in a while when the outfit car would be close by, we'd go down to see it, and everything smelled like kerosene.
The company would have a supply train that would come through about every 3 months. They'd unload coal, they'd unload kerosene for your oil lamps because we had no electricity. And the only thing you had to furnish was your food.
Cars, they converted box cars into bunk cars for them, and they had cook cars.
And of course, part of it was painted green, like everything in the depot was a real pale apple green.
And sometimes Mr. Johnson would come over from Seattle when he knew that we were going out on Thursdays, and he would treat us. So.
The trainmaster himself, his office also was partitioned off in this glass type of partition.
I had an office down there, and we furnished the men to run the trains. We called it the board.
They'd walk up through the hallway and look through this window and see what we had posted.
Both my wife and I, we talk Norwegian.
About 8 of us that had periodically worked on and off together for Overlie in the trainmaster's office. And we'd get together at noon at Harbor Lights or somewhere and have lunch.
And that's one of the nice things about the 30 years working down there. Everybody I worked with was nice. We had our little fights once in a while, but they were over in an hour.
There was no real caste system, you know.
I had the assistant superintendent on my side, but Mr. Johnson got the superintendent and got him on his side, so I lost the battle. But that made him and I lifetime friends after that.
There were 6th Avenue lanes we bowled at. They're still there. We never won any championships.
He and another trainmaster broke into my agent's quarter by forcing the window into my quarters to get in there so they could sit down by the fire. And the section foreman came down too close, saw the light down there, so he came down to see what was going on because he lived up just the hill there. And he peeked in there and he didn't say anything. He saw who it was and he went back to bed. And the next morning I thought, who in the heck's been into my agent's quarters here? And I didn't know. And about a week later, we had a robbery down there at the station. And somebody broke into the station and got the first-class mail.
We had passenger trains for many, many years, and then, of course, finally the passenger trains pretty much phased out and Amtrak took over. The key behind that was really the fact that in the federal government, they hired a man in the postal department who came from the trucking industry.
The passenger trains never really paid for itself, but they got the mail contract.
All of the people going to Seattle were headed for East Olympia, and the people going to Portland were headed for Auburn. So that didn't work out too good. It cost him his job.
When this station was opened in 1911, there were not many automobiles and not many paved roads, and if you wanted to go someplace, you had to go by train.
I've always liked this Union Station building.
Just our power was running about $4,000 a month for the building, and they decided that rather than having this great big building empty, they thought they'd give it to the city as a landmark. So they made an arrangement for the city to come down and take a look at it and see if they would accept it. For $1, they're going to give it to them. And anyway, the city sent down their electrical inspector and plumbing inspector and this type of people, and they looked the building over, and they said, well, it's going to cost $100,000 or more to get this fixed up. So what we'll do, we'll tell the railroad that if they'll pay for all of the expense of bringing this up to date, everything to first-class shape, we'll take it.
We'd always park down below and then we'd walk up the stairs on the south side of the depot. It seemed like after a few years they kept adding steps to it also.
And we loved coming down the cobblestone drive that was behind the Union Station.
In Leicester, we had two operators there. One was the midnight to late operator, and the other was a 4 to midnight. And they hated each other. One would stand in the doorway, and when the minute hand would come up to 4 o'clock, then he'd march in and the other fellow would march out. And they'd even have a line drawn down the middle of the floor, which neither one could cross over. They just hated each other.
There was another very important station at the north end of Tacoma that had switch levers.
And it was operated from a push-button board. I had an entrance button and an exit button. Now, I had 23 electric switches in this plant. And when I'd line a route, I would push an entrance button and an exit button, and it was called an interlocking plant because you couldn't line a conflicting route.
You sit down there and you had the train order book, and he put out orders, meets and ride-overs and whatever, and authority for the trains to run, and you had the train sheet. A train sheet has the name of the towns right down the middle of it, and then on the right side of the eastbound trains, or left side the westbound trains.
There was always kind of a rivalry, you might say, between the people that worked the south end and those that worked the so-called north end, because the south end was all double track, and they were kind of scorned by the people that did the mountain line, which was single track, and was considered much, much harder to operate on than the ease of double track, where you could have trains going in both directions and you didn't have to worry about them hitting one another.
All right, so you can see this is quite a complicated move, because this is all done by hand.
A rule book then was something, really. Nowadays, I don't know how they run a train even.
The next train, you had to balance that power all the time.
Now you got to remember, this is all before computers. This is all handwork.
The railroad labor contracts, especially the train and engine contracts, were probably about the most intricate and complicated labor contracts in the world.
As he dictated the order, he wrote it in this train order book, and then as it was repeated, he would underscore each word to be sure that there was no mistake. So it was a slow system, and when you had a lot of trains, it was hard to talk fast enough and write fast enough to keep up with what had to be done.
One of the first orders I put out, I was telegraphing, and I heard a voice say, "I don't think you want to do that." And it was Frank Ryan. The old man Frank Ryan was sitting behind me at another desk.
He says, "We got problems up here. The cows are dying." And what had happened, this feed got tainted with arsenic, and of course naturally the arsenic is in the bottom of the cars. They dumped the feed out to the hoppers, through the hopper and up into the pile, and of course it's going right through the arsenic, and so the cows were dying around Bellingham, up in Linden area, of course these cows all become prize cows.
Work you've done better be correct, or could end up in a tragedy.
All the trackmen depended on the information that I gave them. And if I gave them any bad information on any train movements or any train locations, they could be in very, very serious trouble with their motor cars out there on the line, and or their high rail trucks out in the line.
If you can't perform the job correctly or properly, the people over you can disqualify you from that job, and it's a bad deal to be disqualified, because that kind of blacklists you from the job.
Theoretically, we had about 2 weeks, but when you figure weekends and things out of that, and the time it takes for the payroll to get to the office from the source and so on, so it was pretty stressful at times.
The yards were pretty dark, and I was always amazed at how silently a boxcar that had just been kicked by a switch crew could roll down a track.
I learned early, always around any of the offices or any place I was, there was an old-timer that seemed to know the answers to any little predicament that came up. It might be some offbeat thing that wouldn't occur in years, but there was always an old-timer over in the corner someplace that knew the answer. He might not have a very good job, he might be an old crab that hated to give up the answer, but there was always one. And I got helped through the years. We all do. And I was sitting in my little private office back in St. Paul one day, and I didn't have anything urgent to be thinking about right at the time, and I got to thinking about how there's always some old guy over in the corner that knew all the answers, and it suddenly occurred to me that I didn't have any little old guy in the corner that I could go back to, that I was the little old man in the corner that was supposed to have all the answers. And you know, I panicked. I have never in my life panicked to that extent at any other time, but I panicked just briefly for a few seconds. I just almost came completely apart.
But there was a lot of stress on the people. I mean, every time you made a meet, actually what you did is when you learned how to work as a dispatcher, they kept cautioning you, now you don't do that until you do this first, and you always followed a certain procedure so that you always looked at your train sheet to see if you had trains coming the other direction, made your meet with every train that was on that sheet, and if you'd miss one, well then of course you're in trouble. That's
the first night I worked was on the north end branches on the Morse telegraph, and I was just scared to death.
You just couldn't bite off more than you could chew, as they used to say, because if you didn't pay attention and it got you excited, you always could go out and talk to the chief.
When you worked as a dispatcher, every train that was out there, actually their lives were in your hands, because if you didn't make good meets, and these trains, we used to call it cornfield meets. If you made a cornfield meet between two towns, well, of course, it's a head-on collision.
It was especially stressful before radios. The first few years I worked, there was no railroad radio, and you couldn't talk to the trains. You just had to anticipate what was going to happen. And
I had never heard that terminology, a crew dying and sending out the dog catch crew, and that kind of threw me for a loop.
You had to be sure that you didn't issue instructions that would cause two trains to collide.
One of the trains that was always on short time was the GN local. And by short time, I mean crews could only work 16 hours a day. If it went past 16 hours, the train had to stop and another crew had to be called to come out and get the train. So these guys were always coming in at 15 hours and 45 minutes, and they were anxious to get into the Great Northern Yard. Well, to get into the Great Northern Yard, you had to run across the same piece of track that the Northern Pacific brought trains from the depot across the 15th Street Bridge and around to the main line. And it was very close to the time that number 423 that ran down to the Grays Harbor area was supposed to come through, but I thought I could sneak them down. Well, I couldn't. And so there is the caboose of the GN local looking at the engine of the number 423 somewhere just about down at the head of the NP yard. So I had to bring the GN local back out, shuffle him around, and finally let 423 out, and the dispatcher is, of course, a little unhappy with me.
We had some tough times, wrecks and slides. And
anyway, I tried for 10 minutes to try to stop that train. Then the next thing we had a phone call. Say there's a Great Northern train all over my yard down here.
When you worked as chief dispatcher, there's hardly a day goes by you don't have at least a switch engine or somebody else or got a car on the ground someplace.
One UP train wanted to back through this turnout for some reason, and I got on the radio and I told the engineer, I says, well, if you come back, I said, come back real easy and listen to me. And he said, okay, so he started moving back. And sure enough, we had a long car and a short car. And right in front of my station, this carload of automobiles was starting to tip over right on me.
I guess the earth is a little soft down by the ocean there, and they just kept shoving cars down into the earth, and one after the other piling on top of one another, till they had about 20 or 30 cars all stacked up in the space of maybe 4 or 5 car lengths.
If a train hits a car, you might as well forget it. They just tear them apart.
Every time you had a derailment, and we used to have a lot of them, that you had to get out of bed no matter what time of the night it was, and go on down and go to work and help get things organized.
I can remember a couple times where the journals were so hot they were on fire. And if that happens and you let it run long enough, you'll burn the journal right off the truck, and the wheel will fall off, and you will then have a wreck.
They called it Crew 2. They used to go out and switch Renton and so forth. It had a little steam engine. And those two got together right out there between Renton and Black River and killed a couple of guys on that little steam engine. And that kind of tore me up. It was on my shift. It wasn't my fault, but it gets to you.
Well, you depended on each other. And it's one of the very critical parts of life that if you don't, there's a no more. There just isn't any more. And so to keep the thing going and vital, you have to have faith in those around you, because if you don't know, ask.
These crossing accidents, because you have to file this F-27 report to the feds and everybody, and explain what happened. There's dead people.
Well, and the chief dispatcher came bursting through the door and said, "Stop all trains," and we didn't know which territory he was talking to. Actually, it was the out by Stillman. A bridge had caught fire, and the people at the McNeil Island Penitentiary had seen the flames, maybe through binoculars or something, and they called the chief and said, "Hey, you got a bridge on fire." Well, we didn't get the notice quite quick enough. Freight train came over the bridge. The locomotives got across, but the cars behind it fell into the bay. That was quite a spectacular wreck.
Yeah, they were stopped. The caboose way back here somewhere. And another train came along, and the crew went to sleep on the engine. And they plowed through that caboose and up through several cars.
When the railroad was coming west earlier, they had to have something to keep the men from killing themselves. They had so many accidents that they had no place to send them in most of the wilderness, so they built hospitals.
They had a kind of a strange rule. It would have made sense, really. If there was a body, you could put the body in a safe position someplace and leave one man there and then take off with the train.
If you made less than $4 a day, it cost you 50 cents a month to have that free hospital and doctors and everything. If you made over $4, it cost you $1 a month.
They would call me whenever there was a wreck, and I would go out with my camera and photograph it, so I have quite a number of old wreck pictures.
Jensen was an old Lincoln pin man. You could always tell a Lincoln pin man because they were usually missing 1 or 2 fingers on each hand. I don't know whether it was bronchitis or what it is, but he had terrible lung problems, and in order to counteract them, he chewed raw garlic. So the first thing that Ehlers would do when he came to work at midnight was open every window in the place to air it out after Dean had been chewing garlic from 4 to midnight.
Anyway, he dropped Ralph out in the alley behind his house, and there was Ralph's wife's cat. And anyway, Ralph says, "That damn cat," he says, "I wish somebody would shoot him, you know." Lance says, "You serious?" And Ralph says, "Yeah." Lance reached in his car and wiped out the cat. Shot the cat, dumped it in somebody's garbage can, and Ralph said, "I felt so bad because there was my wife out there calling the cat." And he knew the cat wasn't going to come because Lance had shot it.
But in every desk drawer, there was a cud of tobacco. And so when he'd go to these different desks to do the job, he would have something to chew, and then he just put it back in the drawer. So,
Did you do the work on that job that the job required? And I said, sure, I did the work on it. He said, well, don't that usually take 8 hours? And I said, well, I suppose it did, but I only worked 6. He says, I want to see a slip in here for 8 hours. So
he was kind of a gruff Papa Bear type person, and he wore a hearing aid. And it was always strange to watch him answer the phone because he didn't put the phone to his ear, he put it to his chest where the receiver for his hearing aid was. So
During the part of the time when I was timekeeping, I was in contact with training enginemen and various employees, but particularly training enginemen, and they were a picturesque bunch in those days. There were a lot of boomers, men that had, in their younger years, had worked all over the country. They get tired of working in one place, they'd quit and go someplace else, or maybe they'd get in a jackpot and get fired and go someplace else.
and I looked down and I couldn't find any clergy. So I knew they told me that it was probably 25 to 30% less, so I just took the regular price and I sat down, I wrote it out, and the agent the next day, he says, well, he says, you did a pretty good job there, you only missed it by 8 cents.
Even like Anabell went over to Spokane off and on, and the superintendent might have his car on the train, and he'd see Anabell, and he'd go up and say, Anabell, where are you going? She said, Spokane. He said, well, I'm going over there too. So he said, come on back and ride in my car with me. So
he was an older man, probably in his 50s or something, very rough looking. He was not very big. He was emaciated, skinny. There were a lot of gandy dancers, laborers in those days, transient laborers, and they were heavy drinkers. They'd work long enough to get a little steak, and then they'd draw their time and drink it up, and then they'd hire out again. And this fellow, he looked like he was in the throes of a hangover, but he took charge in this particular area. He was just a laborer, but he was hollering orders to everybody what to do and so on, and the man was probably the best equipped to do it of anybody on the job, including what officials were there. He seemed to know what should be done every step of the way. And he was working all the time he was doing it. I don't think that I have seen very many times a man doing as competent a job of that when he had no business.
And then you had to measure the importance of the trains. Who had right over who? And that discrimination was very vital to the very existence of the railroad itself.
next train, you had to balance that power all the time.
I don't know. I don't think their system now is as reliable, actually, as when we had operators and men every so many miles watching the trains.
They just were bums. Some of them were educated men, doctors, lawyers. They just couldn't cope with life as it was, and they just went on the bum, and they'd worked long enough to get a steak, quit, drink it up, go back to work.
It was a nice place, and we had about 18 different intensity sounders across the top of the table there, and you could tell who was calling you just by listening to the sounder because of its identity.
And this old engineer took a liking to those whistles. It was different than what he had on his engine, and it became an obsession with him. Finally, he figured out some way. He managed to steal a whistle off of one of the other locomotives and smuggle it onto his engine. And then he got to thinking he'd be sure to be caught with that whistle on there. So he thought it over for a while, hauled it back and forth in the toolbox until finally he threw it in the river one night when there was...
And at UP Junction there, I had 3 telegraph wires coming in. I had the UP dispatcher's phone, the UP telegraph wire. I had Northern Pacific dispatcher, and I had the relay WR wire.
He says, Mr. Kurgan, he says, how should I write out my time slip? And he looked at him and he says, well, he says, you got the date on there, you got everything else, you got your name on that, you got it signed? He says, yeah. He says, well, stick it. He says, anybody who has worked here for 35 years and doesn't know how to make his own time slip.
T.J. Kane was a real railroader. He was not one that was an engineer or conductor, but he knew railroads inside and out.
As he came down and sat next to me, he says, well, kid, it's your turn now. And he says, you know, if you goof up, that's it. Up he got and walked out.
You only worked 6 days a week, but they'd force you to work 7 days a week. And if you were a low man on a totem pole, you worked or quit. So I needed the job, so I worked. But anyway, Jim and I, we just did a disappearing act. We wouldn't answer the phones for 3 days.
It was in the $30 range somewhere for 8 hours. And then it went to $50. And I thought, boy, that's really something, you know. And when I retired, it was $160. And now it's $200 a day for the dispatchers.
I was bringing home about $210 a month back in 1940, and that 41, and that was good money then.
I went to work for the railroad because it was a job, and when the Depression started, I had no intention of following my dad's footsteps or anything like that, but a job was a job in those days.
I worked in McCarver Street down there, you know, by the top of the ocean, and I was checking the payroll book, and it was less than $1 an hour, 90 or 87 cents or some darn thing. I says, hell, I could make more than that from shoveling the snow.
And 8 to 4 would be a first trick, and 4 to midnight a second trick, and midnight till 8 in the morning would be the graveyard shift or the third trick. 48 or 49, we started going for a 6-day week, and we didn't go to a 5-day week until sometime in the 1950s.
One year, Jim Fredrickson was the, I think, second trick operator at Martin, which is just on one side of the Stampede Tunnel. And near Martin, there are 2 good ski places, one for the University of Washington and one for, I believe it was the Mountaineer Ski Club. So all the crew from the depot here would rent ski gear and go up and camp in Jim's little shack up at Martin. And sometime we'd have, it was a little 2-room with a small kitchen place. And sometimes we'd have 10, 15 people camped out in there on the weekend so we could get some free skiing in.
And they would tell you whether you were going to make it or not. And sometimes they say, well, I think you've done a pretty good job, but you still have a long ways to go. Well, that made you even more alert as to what was going on, and you didn't just allow things to happen. You absolutely studied them, because it was, and you get your mind so it vacillates back and forth. Now I see what's happening, but what could happen? And you want to lower that percentage as much as you possibly can, because everything, the things that we love and protect, and the people that you know, the good friends, you want to protect them too.
You get on a train and you're going by raging rivers and babbling brooks and crossing the mountains and seeing the other sides of what America looks like.
It's kind of a fascinating job, really. I loved it. It was great.
I always liked to hear that train whistle blow.